They called it the eyesore behind his back, their perfectly manicured voices dripping with disdain as they described the crumbling, Victorian farmhouse that sat like a rotting tooth on what they considered prime real estate. What they didn't know was that beneath the sagging floorboards and peeling paint lay a network of Prohibition-era tunnels containing artifacts and architectural features that would soon be appraised at over $3 million. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The November rain drummed against the warped windows of the Hartwell homestead as Marcus Chen-Hartwell stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of instant coffee with a bent spoon. The water came from a well that sometimes ran brown after heavy storms, and the electricity flickered whenever the wind picked up, which in rural Pennsylvania meant most days from October through April. The house groaned around him like an old ship in a storm, every board and beam settling deeper into the foundation that had been laid in 1847 by his great-grandfather, Silas Hartwell. Marcus had inherited the property 18 months ago when his grandmother Eleanor passed away at 93, taking with her most of the family stories and all of the money that might have kept the old place from falling into complete disrepair. The inheritance came with 17 acres of rolling hills, a barn that leaned so far to the east it seemed to defy physics, and a house that Eleanor had maintained through sheer force of will and an impressive collection of duct tape solutions. Doorbell, which hadn't worked since the Carter administration, remained silent as Marcus heard the distinctive purr of a luxury sedan pulling into his gravel driveway. Through the kitchen window, he watched his wife Sarah emerge from the passenger side of her parents' silver Bentley, her expression already apologetic as she surveyed the property with the eyes of someone seeing it through her family's perspective. Behind her, Victoria and Hammond Pemberton III unfolded themselves from the vehicle with the careful precision of people wearing clothing that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Victoria Pemberton was 62 years old and had spent the last 4 decades perfecting the art of disappointment. She stood 5 feet 6 inches in her stockings, though her signature 3-inch heels added enough height to look down on most situations with literal as well as metaphorical superiority. Her ash blonde hair was maintained by a stylist who charged more per hour than Marcus made in a week, and her wardrobe consisted entirely of clothes that required dry cleaning and careful storage. She surveyed Marcus's property the way an exterminator might examine a particularly challenging infestation. Hammond Pemberton III had made his fortune in commercial real estate development, turning struggling neighborhoods into shopping complexes and historic districts into parking lots. At 65, he possessed the kind of confidence that came from never having been wrong about anything that mattered to his bank account. His handshake was firm, his smile was practiced, and his ability to calculate property values was legendary among Philadelphia's development community. He looked at the Hartwell homestead and saw nothing but wasted potential and his daughter's poor judgment in marrying someone who would choose sentiment over sensible investment strategies. Sarah Chen-Hartwell had met Marcus during their junior year at Penn State, where he was studying sustainable agriculture and she was pursuing a degree in environmental science that her parents had tolerated only because it was better than the art history major she'd originally declared. Their courtship had been conducted largely away from her family's scrutiny, and their wedding had been a small affair that Victoria had described to her friends as intimate by necessity rather than choice. Sarah loved Marcus with a fierce loyalty that sometimes put her in the uncomfortable position of defending choices she wasn't entirely sure she understood herself. The 3 figures approached the house across the uneven walkway that Marcus had been meaning to repair since spring. The flagstones were original to the property, some of them cracked and shifted by more than a century of freeze-thaw cycles, but they had character that new concrete could never replicate. Victoria navigated the irregular surface with visible irritation, her heels clicking against the stone in an irregular rhythm that seemed to emphasize every imperfection. Marcus opened the front door before they could knock, knowing that the ancient doorbell was purely decorative and that the brass knocker had been painted over so many times it no longer moved. The hinges squeaked in a way that Eleanor had claimed was the house's way of announcing visitors, though Marcus suspected it was simply the house's way of announcing its need for WD-40 and professional maintenance. "Welcome to the Hartwell place," Marcus said, stepping aside to let them enter the foyer that had once been grand, but now served mainly to showcase everything that was wrong with the house. The wallpaper was peeling in artistic curls that revealed 3 different patterns underneath, suggesting decades of decorating decisions made by people who prioritized economy over aesthetics. The hardwood floors, while original and technically valuable, were scuffed and dull from years of foot traffic and deferred maintenance. Victoria's gaze swept the space with the efficiency of someone conducting a property inspection for insurance purposes. She noted the water stain on the ceiling that Marcus had been meaning to investigate, the loose banister that wobbled when touched, and the general atmosphere of genteel decay that permeated every surface. Her expression conveyed the kind of polite horror that wealthy people reserve for situations that were unfortunate, but not quite tragic enough to warrant genuine sympathy. Hammond's assessment was more practical and considerably more brutal. He saw load-bearing walls that had probably shifted, a heating system that likely predated modern efficiency standards, and electrical wiring that was almost certainly a fire hazard waiting for the right combination of weather conditions and bad luck. His mental calculator was already running numbers on demolition costs and lot value, subtracting the expense of dealing with what he assumed were foundation problems and environmental issues that old houses inevitably harbored. "Sarah mentioned you've been doing some renovation work," Victoria said, her voice carrying the tone of someone commenting on a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. She gestured vaguely toward the living room, where Marcus had spent weekends, trying to repair the damage that time and weather had inflicted on Eleanor's decorating choices. His efforts were visible, but amateur, the work of someone who watched YouTube tutorials and hoped for the best rather than hiring professionals who understood the complexities of historic home restoration. The living room showcased Marcus's determination, if not his expertise. He had stripped wallpaper from 2 walls, revealing plaster that needed professional attention but was structurally sound. His attempt at refinishing the original hardwood floors had produced mixed results, with some sections gleaming like new and others bearing the marks of a learning curve that involved several different grades of sandpaper and more than one do-over. The furniture was a combination of pieces inherited from Eleanor and items acquired from thrift stores and garage sales, united by function rather than aesthetic coherence. "It's a work in progress," Marcus admitted, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone who had heard similar criticisms before and had run out of ways to explain why he was choosing the difficult path instead of the sensible one. "The house has good bones. It just needs someone willing to put in the time to bring out its potential." Hammond's laugh was brief and humorless, the sound of someone who had heard similar optimism from countless property owners who didn't understand the economics of restoration versus replacement. "Son, I've been in real estate for 30 years, and I can tell you that good bones is what people say when everything else is falling apart. This place would cost more to fix than it would to knock down and start over." Sarah moved through the room with careful diplomacy, touching surfaces that her parents were pointedly avoiding and making positive comments about details that wouldn't have been visible to less generous observers. She admired the original crown molding that Marcus had spent hours cleaning, complimented the hardwood floors that showed promise despite their current condition, and expressed enthusiasm for the bay window that offered views of the properties. Rolling hills when you ignored the fact that 2 of the window panes were cracked and the sill was soft with rot. "The kitchen has been completely updated," Marcus said, leading them toward the back of the house where he had invested most of his renovation budget, and energy. The space retained its original proportions, but featured appliances that were functional if not fashionable, countertops that were clean if not granite, and cabinets that Eleanor had painted sage green sometime in the 1980s and that Marcus had touched up with mixed success. Victoria examined the kitchen with the attention of someone evaluating a crime scene. She noted the mismatched cabinet hardware, the linoleum flooring that was probably older than Sarah, and the general atmosphere of someone trying to make the best of a situation that really called for professional intervention and substantial financial investment. Her silence was more damning than any comment could have been, conveying the kind of disappointment that wealthy parents reserved for children who had failed to meet expectations that had never been explicitly stated, but were somehow always understood. Tour continued through rooms that told the story of a house caught between past grandeur and present reality. Eleanor's bedroom had been converted into Marcus's office, where he conducted the freelance consulting work that paid their bills and allowed him to pursue his dream of sustainable farming on what remained of the original Hartwell acreage. The space contained a desk made from sawhorses and plywood, filing cabinets acquired from an office liquidation sale, and a computer system that was functional but several generations behind current technology standards. Hammond's questions came with the relentless precision of someone conducting a property evaluation for purposes that had nothing to do with sentiment or family history. He wanted to know about the age of the roof, the condition of the foundation, the status of the electrical system, and the capacity of the well that supplied their water. His inquiries revealed a comprehensive understanding of everything that could go wrong with an old house and a complete lack of appreciation for anything that might go right. "What are your long-term plans for the property?" Victoria asked as they returned to the living room, her question carrying undertones that suggested she had already formed opinions about the answer. Her gaze swept the space again, cataloging details that confirmed her initial assessment, while searching for evidence that might contradict her growing conviction that her daughter had made a serious error in judgment. Marcus's response came slowly, measured with the careful consideration of someone who had thought deeply about questions that other people answered automatically. "We want to restore the house to something that Eleanor would recognize and be proud of. The property has been in my family for 5 generations. There are stories in these walls, connections to the past that you can't replicate with new construction." The silence that followed his answer was heavy with unspoken criticism and barely contained frustration. Victoria and Hammond exchanged the kind of look that married couples develop after decades of shared disappointment in other people's life choices. Their expression conveyed a complete inability to understand how anyone could choose historical significance over market value, sentiment over sense, or family legacy over financial opportunity. Outside, the November wind picked up strength, rattling windows that had weathered more than a century of Pennsylvania storms and sending leaves skittering across the porch that Marcus had been meaning to repair since summer. The house settled around them with the creaks and groans that old buildings made when temperature and humidity fluctuated, sounds that Marcus had learned to interpret as communication rather than distress signals. What none of them could have imagined was that beneath their feet, hidden behind walls that had kept secrets for nearly a century, lay evidence of a chapter in American history that would transform their understanding of the Hartwell property's true value and significance. The Pembertons' visit stretched into its 3rd day, and each morning brought fresh evidence of their disappointment with their daughter's living situation. Victoria had established herself in what had once been Eleanor's sewing room, a space that Marcus had hastily converted into a guest bedroom by moving his grandmother's fabric collection to the basement and installing a bed frame purchased from a discount furniture store. The room's single window faced east, flooding the space with morning light that revealed every flaw in the hastily applied paint job in the water, damage that Marcus had tried to cover with strategically placed furniture. Hammond had taken to conducting what he called property assessments during his morning coffee, walking the grounds with the measured pace of someone cataloging deficiencies for future reference. His dress shoes, handmade Italian leather, that cost more than Marcus's monthly grocery budget, were entirely unsuitable for traversing 17 acres of uneven terrain, but he persisted with the determination of someone gathering evidence for an argument he intended to win. The morning routine had become a source of tension that permeated every interaction. Marcus rose at dawn to complete his outdoor chores before his in-laws emerged from their room, hoping to avoid the commentary that inevitably accompanied any attempt to maintain the property in their presence. He repaired fence sections that had been damaged by the previous night's wind, collected eggs from the chickens that Eleanor had insisted were essential for true self-sufficiency, and attempted to address the most pressing maintenance issues. Before Victoria's critical gaze could catalog them for future discussion, Sarah found herself occupying an increasingly uncomfortable middle ground, defending choices she wasn't entirely certain she believed in while trying to maintain family relationships that seemed to grow more strained with each passing hour. Her parents' criticism wasn't direct enough to warrant confrontation, but their disappointment was palpable, expressed through loaded silences and meaningful glances that conveyed volumes about their assessment of her husband's prospects and their daughter's judgment. The kitchen had become a battlefield of subtle domestic warfare. Victoria had offered to prepare breakfast on their second morning, a gesture that seemed generous until it became clear that her real purpose was demonstrating the inadequacy of Marcus's appliances and supplies. She searched through cabinets that contained mismatched dishes and utensils acquired from various sources, her expression growing increasingly disapproving as she discovered the reality of how people lived when they prioritized necessity over aesthetics. "Sarah, darling," Victoria said while examining a coffee mug that bore the logo of a local diner, "surely you could register for some proper dishware. Your grandmother Pemberton's china service is sitting unused in our guest dining room. It seems such a waste when you're making do with these eclectic pieces." Marcus listened from the adjacent living room, where he was attempting to repair a loose electrical outlet that had been sparking intermittently since the weekend. His tool collection consisted primarily of implements inherited from Eleanor and supplemented by purchases from hardware store clearance sales. The work was slow and frustrating, complicated by wiring that predated modern safety standards and his own limited expertise in electrical systems that required professional attention he couldn't afford. Hammond's commentary focused on larger structural issues that he identified with the confidence of someone who had demolished enough old buildings to recognize terminal decay when he saw it. He pointed out foundation settling that was visible in the basement, roof sagging that was apparent from certain angles, and heating inefficiency that was evident in the temperature variations between different rooms. His observations were delivered with the clinical precision of someone documenting evidence rather than offering helpful suggestions. "The heating bills alone must be astronomical," Hammond announced during lunch, gesturing toward windows that were original to the house and therefore lacking modern insulation properties. "These old places are money pits. Every dollar you put into repairs is just throwing good money after bad. The smart financial move would be to sell the land and put the proceeds towards something more practical." Marcus had heard variations of this argument from friends, neighbors, and financial advisors who couldn't understand why anyone would choose preservation over profit. His responses had become increasingly defensive over the months since inheriting the property, worn down by the constant need to justify decisions that felt obvious to him but appeared irrational to everyone else. The weight of explaining sentiment to people who measured everything in terms of return on investment had become a burden that followed him through every room of the house. The financial pressure was real and growing, more serious with each passing month. Marcus's freelance consulting income was irregular, depending on projects that came through professional networks and referrals from previous clients. His expertise in sustainable agriculture and environmental remediation was valuable but specialized, serving a niche market that paid well when work was available but offered no guarantee of steady employment. The combination of property taxes, insurance premiums, utility costs, and maintenance expenses consumed most of his earnings, leaving little margin for the major repairs that the house desperately needed. Sarah's teaching salary provided some stability, but her position at the local elementary school was part-time and temporary, filling in for a teacher on maternity leave. The uncertainty of her employment status added another layer of stress to their financial situation, particularly when combined with the knowledge that her parents could solve their money problems with a casual generosity that they had chosen not to extend. The Pembertons' wealth was old and substantial, built through generations of careful investment and strategic property development. Their mainline mansion sat on 2 manicured acres that required a staff of professional landscapers to maintain. Their furniture was antique, their art was authentic, and their lifestyle reflected the kind of effortless elegance that money could provide when it had been accumulating for decades. They moved through the world with the confidence of people who had never experienced genuine financial anxiety, who could not conceive of circumstances that would require choosing between repairs and groceries. Victoria's attempts to help revealed the vast gulf between their circumstances and Marcus's reality. She offered to purchase new curtains for the living room, apparently unaware that the windows needed professional restoration before any window treatments could be properly installed. She suggested hiring a cleaning service to address what she perceived as housekeeping deficiencies, not understanding that the problems she identified were structural issues that required renovation rather than maintenance. Her generosity was genuine but misdirected, focused on symptoms rather than causes. The social dynamics created by the visit extended beyond immediate family tensions. Marcus's neighbors, many of whom struggled with their own aging properties and limited incomes, watched the Bentleys' comings and goings with interested speculation. The contrast between the luxury vehicle and the neighborhood's general economic circumstances was impossible to ignore, raising questions about Marcus's background and his in-laws' assessment of their daughter's living situation. Harold Brennan, who owned the adjacent farm and had been Eleanor's closest neighbor for 30 years, made a point of stopping by during his evening walk to meet the visitors and offer his perspective on the property's history and potential. Harold's own farmhouse was in similar condition to Marcus's, maintained through necessity and ingenuity rather than professional restoration, and his presence served as a reminder that the Hartwell place was part of a community where financial limitations were common and pragmatic solutions were valued over perfect aesthetics. Eleanor always said this house had secrets, Harold mentioned during his conversation with Hammond, his comment delivered with the casual tone of someone sharing neighborhood folklore rather than providing investment advice. The old-timers used to tell stories about the Prohibition years, when this area was dry in name only. Of course, Eleanor never put much stock in those tales, but she always said there were parts of the house she'd never fully explored. Hammond's response was politely dismissive, the reaction of someone who had heard enough ghost stories and local legends to recognize romantic thinking when it interfered with practical assessment. He was interested in foundation stability and market comparables, not family folklore and historical speculation. His focus remained fixed on quantifiable problems that could be addressed through demolition and redevelopment rather than preservation and restoration. The evenings brought particularly difficult moments, when the family gathered in the living room and conversation inevitably turned to future plans and financial realities. Victoria and Hammond's questions came with increasing directness as their visit progressed, probing the sustainability of Marcus's current approach and the wisdom of his long-term strategy. Their concern for Sarah's welfare was genuine, but their proposed solutions invariably involved abandoning the property and pursuing opportunities that aligned more closely with conventional definitions of success. Marcus's responses grew shorter and more defensive as the pressure mounted. He found himself explaining the same arguments repeatedly, defending choices that felt deeply personal against criticism that was presented as practical wisdom. The weight of constant justification was exhausting, particularly when combined with the daily stress of maintaining a property that seemed determined to develop new problems faster than he could address existing ones. The house itself seemed to conspire against him during the visit, developing issues that had been dormant for months, but chose this week to demand attention. A pipe in the upstairs bathroom developed a persistent drip that echoed through the walls at night. The furnace made grinding noises that suggested imminent failure despite Marcus's recent attempts at maintenance. The kitchen faucet began producing water with a metallic taste that required explanation and apology. Each new problem provided fresh ammunition for Hammond's arguments about the impracticality of old house ownership and the financial wisdom of cutting losses before they multiplied further. His commentary was delivered with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious truths to people who were too emotionally invested to recognize practical reality. The cumulative effect was a constant atmosphere of judgment that made Marcus feel like a defendant in a trial, where the verdict had been decided before the evidence was presented. Sarah's growing frustration with the situation was evident in her increasingly frequent absences from family conversations. She volunteered for extra errands that took her away from the house, lingered at school longer than necessary to complete tasks that could have been finished at home, and found reasons to visit friends who lived far enough away to require extended trips. Her absence left Marcus to face her parents' criticism alone, defending decisions that affected both of them, but that he was expected to justify without her support. The financial calculations that Hammond performed with casual accuracy were devastating. In their precision, he could determine exactly how much money Marcus had invested in the property, estimate the additional costs required for proper restoration, and compare those figures to the potential return on investment that alternative strategies might provide. His mathematics were irrefutable, his logic was sound, and his conclusions were presented with the authority of someone who had made similar calculations thousands of times throughout his successful career. What Hammond could not calculate, and what Marcus struggled to articulate, was the value of continuity and connection that the property represented. The house was more than a financial asset. It was a repository of family history and a bridge between past and future that could not be replicated through new construction or alternative investments. The stories that Harold had mentioned, the secrets that Eleanor had hinted at, and the sense of belonging that came from maintaining family land were intangible assets that existed outside conventional economic analysis. As the third evening approached, and the Pembertons prepared for their departure the following morning, Marcus found himself hoping that their absence would restore some equilibrium to his life, while dreading the conversations that Sarah would inevitably initiate once they were alone again. The Pembertons' departure left behind a silence that felt heavier than their presence had been. Marcus stood in the driveway, watching the Bentley's taillights disappear around the bend that led back to the main road, while Sarah remained inside, ostensibly cleaning the guest room, but actually avoiding the conversation they both knew was coming. The gravel beneath his feet was still warm from the car's exhaust, and the November air carried the scent of approaching winter mixed with the faint residue of Victoria's expensive perfume. Within 48 hours, the first envelope arrived. The return address belonged to Pemberton and Associates, Hammond's commercial development firm, and the contents were presented with the professional courtesy that wealthy people employed when making offers that weren't really negotiable. The letterhead was embossed, the paper was heavy stock, and the language was precisely calibrated to sound generous while delivering an ultimatum that left little room for misinterpretation. Marcus read the document twice before fully understanding its implications. Hammond had commissioned a comprehensive property evaluation from 3 independent appraisal firms, each of which had concluded that the Hartwell homestead represented a significant financial liability that would require investment far exceeding any reasonable return. The appraisals were thorough, professional, and devastating in their unanimous assessment that the property's highest and best use involved demolition, followed by subdivision into residential lots suitable for modern construction. The covering letter expressed Hammond's concern for his daughter's financial security and his willingness to facilitate a solution that would protect Sarah's interests while allowing Marcus to pursue opportunities more aligned with his skills and education. The offer was presented as family assistance rather than commercial transaction, though the terms were structured with the precision of someone who had negotiated countless real estate deals and understood exactly how to create proposals that appeared generous while serving his strategic objectives. The purchase price exceeded the property's assessed value by 15%, a premium that Hammond characterized as recognition of the land's sentimental significance and his desire to minimize the financial impact of Marcus's decision to prioritize family legacy over practical considerations. The offer included provisions for a 90-day closing period that would allow Marcus time to relocate while avoiding the stress of rushed decision-making under financial pressure. Most significantly, the proposal included a separate arrangement that would establish a trust fund for Sarah's benefit, ensuring her financial security regardless of Marcus's career prospects or their marriage's long-term viability. The trust was structured to provide income that would exceed Sarah's current teaching salary, effectively removing financial stress as a factor in their relationship, while creating economic independence that would give her options that her current circumstances didn't support. Sarah discovered the documents on their kitchen table when she returned from school, her teaching bag still slung over her shoulder and her clothes bearing the cheerful chaos that came from spending 8 hours with second graders. Her reaction was immediate and complex, cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been relief before settling into the careful neutrality that she employed when family loyalties conflicted with personal desires. They had no right to do this without discussing it with us first, she said, though her tone suggested she was arguing against her own inclinations rather than expressing genuine outrage. Her fingers traced the elegant letterhead while her eyes moved through paragraphs that outlined financial security beyond anything their current circumstances could provide. The numbers were significant enough to represent life-changing opportunity, the kind of windfall that could eliminate debt, fund graduate education, and provide the foundation for the middle-class stability that her upbringing had taught her to value. Marcus's response was complicated by the realization that Hammond's offer was genuinely generous rather than exploitative. The purchase price was fair market value plus a substantial premium. The terms were reasonable, and the additional provisions for Sarah's benefit demonstrated consideration for her welfare that extended beyond mere transaction. Refusing the offer meant choosing financial uncertainty over security, sentiment over pragmatism, and personal stubbornness over family harmony. The pressure campaign that followed was conducted with the sophisticated efficiency that Hammond brought to all his business dealings. Rather than applying direct pressure that might provoke resistance, he orchestrated a series of indirect influences that gradually accumulated weight, while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. The approach was subtle, professional, and relentlessly effective in creating an environment where accepting his offer appeared increasingly inevitable. Victoria's contribution involved social pressure applied through Sarah's network of college friends and former classmates. Casual conversations revealed that several couples in their social circle had recently purchased homes in developments that offered modern amenities, professional landscaping, and the kind of community infrastructure that supported young families. The comparisons were never explicit, but the implications were clear. Successful people chose convenience over character, investment over inheritance, and practical decision-making over romantic attachment to the past. The financial pressure was applied through Marcus's professional network in ways that initially appeared coincidental, but gradually revealed systematic coordination. Consulting projects that had been discussed for months suddenly encountered unexpected delays or budget reductions that eliminate his anticipated income. Potential clients who had expressed interest in his environmental remediation services chose competitors whose proposals were less comprehensive but more immediately available. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Work was drying up precisely when he needed income most desperately. Hammond's connections in the development community provided additional leverage through strategic sharing of information about zoning, changes and infrastructure improvements planned for the area. Marcus learned through neighbors that the county was considering road improvements that would increase property values but also raise tax assessments beyond what most current residents could afford. The timing was presented as fortunate coincidence that made Hammond's offer particularly advantageous, though the coordination suggested more deliberate orchestration. The local bank where Marcus had attempted to secure financing from Major House Repairs suddenly revised their lending criteria in ways that eliminated his qualification for the renovation loan he had been pursuing. The changes were presented as responses to federal regulations and risk management requirements, but their timing coincided perfectly with Hammond's campaign to demonstrate the impracticality of Marcus's restoration plans. Alternative financing sources proved similarly unaccommodating, as if information about his situation had been systematically shared throughout the regional banking community. Sarah's teaching position faced unexpected complications when budget constraints forced the school district to eliminate several temporary positions, including hers. The decision was presented as unavoidable response to state funding reductions, but the timing created immediate financial pressure that made Hammond's offer appear prophetic rather than opportunistic. Sarah's prospects for finding alternative employment in the area were limited by the same budget constraints affecting other districts, while opportunities in more prosperous communities would require relocation anyway. The isolation that Marcus experienced extended beyond financial pressure to include social ostracism that was subtle but unmistakable. Neighbors who had previously been friendly became politely distant, as if association with someone refusing such a generous offer reflected poor judgment that might be contagious. Local contractors who had provided estimates for repair work became unavailable or raised their prices to levels that made their services effectively inaccessible. The message was clear. The community expected him to accept reality and stop fighting inevitable economic forces. Victoria's research into Marcus's family history produced additional ammunition for their campaign, delivered through conversations with Sarah that were presented as helpful genealogy that served to undermine his attachment to the property. She discovered that the Hartwell family had been involved in several business failures during the early 20th century, suggesting that poor financial judgment might be a hereditary trait that Marcus was repeating through his stubborn attachment to a property that had been a burden to previous generations. The documentation Victoria provided included historical records showing that Marcus's great-grandfather had nearly lost the property during the Depression, saved only by a mysterious influx of cash whose source remained unclear in family records. The implication was that even previous generations had recognized the property's limitations and sought ways to extract value rather than preserve legacy. Marcus's romantic attachment to family history was presented as willful ignorance of practical realities that his ancestors had understood and addressed. When circumstances required rational decision-making, Hammond's professional network provided access to development consultants who offered unsolicited analysis of the property's potential for commercial use. Their reports suggested that the land's proximity to proposed highway improvements made it ideal for retail development that would serve the growing suburban communities in adjacent townships. The economic impact would benefit the entire region. while providing Marcus with returns that far exceeded what agricultural use or historic preservation could generate. The pressure campaign reached new intensity when Hammond arranged for Sarah to meet with a financial planner who specialized in wealth management for young professionals. The consultation was presented as educational opportunity rather than sales presentation, but the analysis revealed exactly how Hammond's offer could be invested to provide long-term security that would eliminate financial stress from their marriage, while funding opportunities that Marcus's current approach could never support. The financial planner's projections showed how the trust fund income could support graduate education that would qualify Sarah for administrative positions in education, allowing her to pursue career advancement that her current circumstances made impossible. The additional security would also support starting a family without the financial constraints that currently made such decisions premature. The presentation was professional, comprehensive, and devastating in its demonstration of opportunities that refusing Hammond's offer would eliminate. Marcus found himself increasingly isolated as the pressure mounted from multiple directions. Simultaneously, his attempts to discuss the situation with friends and colleagues were met with gentle but firm advice that accepting the offer was obviously the sensible choice. The consensus was so universal that continuing to resist appeared irrational rather than principled, stubborn rather than loyal to family heritage. The mounting stress affected his relationship with Sarah in ways that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Their conversations grew shorter and more strained as the gap between their circumstances and their options became more apparent. Sarah's patience with their financial limitations was wearing thin, particularly when solutions were available that required only Marcus's willingness to prioritize their future over his attachment to the past. The house itself seemed to conspire against him as winter approached and heating bills increased while his income decreased. Every creaking board and drafty window reminded him of repairs he couldn't afford, while every conversation with Sarah reminded him of opportunities they were losing through his inflexibility. The weight of responsibility for their financial security pressed down on him with increasing intensity as Hammond's deadline approached and alternatives disappeared. What Marcus couldn't understand was why Hammond was so determined to acquire this particular property when other development opportunities were surely available. The passion behind the offer suggested motivations beyond simple commercial opportunity, but Hammond's explanations focused solely on family concern and financial pragmatism. There was something driving the campaign that remained hidden beneath the surface of generous offers and practical arguments. The answer lay buried beneath the house, waiting in tunnels that had kept their secrets for nearly a century, holding artifacts and architectural features that would soon transform Marcus's understanding of what he was fighting to preserve. The first anomaly appeared during Marcus's attempt to repair the basement's recurring moisture problem. The December cold had frozen the ground solid enough to prevent external drainage work, forcing him to investigate the source of dampness that had been plaguing the house's foundation since before Eleanor's time. Armed with a borrowed moisture meter and a determination born of financial desperation, Marcus began a systematic examination of the basement walls that would reveal inconsistencies he had never noticed during his previous visits to the space. Basement itself was larger than most houses of the Victorian era typically featured, extending beneath the entire footprint of the main structure, plus a portion that seemed to continue beyond the house's visible boundaries. Eleanor had used the space primarily for storage, filling it with decades of accumulated possessions that created a maze of furniture, boxes, and equipment that obscured the architectural details. Marcus's recent efforts to organize the chaos had revealed stone walls that appeared to be original construction, though several sections displayed masonry work that seemed inconsistent with the rest of the foundation. The moisture readings were puzzling in their irregularity. Sections of the north wall registered bone dry despite being below ground level and adjacent to areas where dampness was obvious and problematic. The dry sections corresponded to portions of the wall where the mortar between stones appeared newer than the surrounding construction, as if repairs had been made using different materials or techniques than the original builders had employed. Marcus had initially attributed these differences to maintenance work that Eleanor or previous generations had performed, but closer examination revealed patterns that suggested more systematic modification. Dr. Amanda Reeves noticed the first architectural inconsistency during her visit to examine the house's potential for historic preservation designation. As a professor of American architectural history at nearby Gettysburg College, Dr. Reeves had been contacted by the County Historical Society after Harold Brennan mentioned the property's age and potential significance. Her expertise in 19th century construction techniques made her an ideal candidate to evaluate the house's eligibility for historic registry, which Marcus hoped might provide financial incentives for restoration while creating legal protections against demolition. Dr. Reeves spent 3 hours measuring rooms, photographing details, and documenting construction elements that would support her assessment of the house's historical value. Her examination was thorough and systematic, covering everything from foundation stones to roof framing, and her observations were recorded with the precision of someone whose academic reputation depended on accuracy rather than sentiment. What she discovered challenged her understanding of typical Victorian-era construction practices in rural Pennsylvania. The basement configuration is unusual for a house of this period, Dr. Reeves mentioned while reviewing her notes with Marcus in the kitchen. Her laptop displayed floor plans that she had sketched based on measurements taken throughout the house, and the drawings revealed proportions that didn't align with standard architectural patterns from the 1840s. The foundation extends beyond the house footprint in ways that suggest either later additions or original construction that served purposes beyond typical domestic needs. Marcus had never considered the basement size as unusual, having grown up visiting Eleanor and accepting the space as simply part of the house's character. Dr. Reeves's observations forced him to view familiar spaces through different eyes, noticing details that had been invisible when viewed as normal rather than remarkable. The implications of her analysis suggested that his great-grandfather had built the house with specific requirements that extended beyond typical family needs. The chimney system provided additional evidence of architectural anomalies that Dr. Reeves found intriguing rather than problematic. Victorian houses typically featured multiple chimneys to serve fireplaces and heating systems throughout the structure, but the Hartwell house contained flue systems that seemed to serve no visible purpose. Several chimney passages ran through walls where no fireplaces had ever existed, and their termination points in the basement suggested connections to systems that were no longer obvious or functional. It's possible that previous owners removed fireplaces during modernization efforts, Dr. Reeves explained. Though her tone suggested she found this explanation less than completely satisfactory. However, the chimney configurations are more extensive than typical heating requirements would justify. Some of these passages appear to have been designed for ventilation rather than combustion, which suggests industrial or commercial applications. That would be unusual in a rural domestic setting. Marcus's exploration of these mysterious chimney systems revealed additional puzzles that deepened rather than resolved his understanding of the house's original design. Several passages could be accessed through panels that were concealed behind built-in bookcases or storage cabinets, their existence invisible until deliberate searching revealed their location. The passages themselves were lined with brick and featured construction quality that matched the rest of the house, indicating that they were original elements rather than later modifications. Harold Brennan's casual mention of Prohibition-era folklore gained new significance as Marcus began discovering architectural features that aligned with stories about the area's bootlegging history. During their December conversation about property maintenance, Harold shared additional details about local legends that he had previously dismissed as entertaining fiction rather than historical fact. His memories of conversations with elderly neighbors who had known the area during the 1920s contained references to underground activities that suddenly seemed less like romantic exaggeration and more like carefully preserved oral history. Old Mrs. Patterson used to tell stories about her grandfather's deliveries to houses in this area during the dry years, Harold mentioned while helping Marcus clear ice from the front steps. Course, nobody talked about what they were delivering, but she always said there were houses around here that had more visitors during Prohibition than they'd had before or since. Your great-great-grandfather was known for keeping to himself, but he somehow managed to maintain this place better than most during some pretty lean times. The financial records that Marcus discovered while organizing Eleanor's papers supported Harold's recollections about the family's mysterious prosperity during difficult economic periods. Bank statements and property tax records from the 1920s and early 1930s showed regular deposits and payments that were inconsistent with the agricultural income that the land could have generated. Eleanor had saved financial documents with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood their historical importance. Though she had never discussed their implications with family members, the documentation revealed that Silas Hartwell had somehow maintained mortgage payments and property improvements during the Depression when most of his neighbors were losing their farms to foreclosure. The source of his income was never specified in the records Eleanor had preserved, but the consistency of his financial stability during a period of widespread economic hardship suggested revenue streams that extended beyond conventional farming operations. The timing corresponded exactly with Prohibition enforcement and the subsequent repeal that would have eliminated demand for illegal alcohol distribution. Marcus's discovery of a concealed room behind the basement's north wall provided the most significant evidence that the house contained secrets that Eleanor had either never known or had chosen not to share with subsequent generations. The room's entrance was hidden behind wooden shelving that appeared to be permanently installed, but actually swung away from the wall when the correct combination of pressure points was activated. The mechanism was sophisticated and well-maintained, suggesting regular use rather than forgotten construction. The hidden room itself was smaller than a typical bedroom, but larger than a storage closet, with stone walls that showed the same expert masonry as the rest of the foundation. The space was empty except for wooden shelving along 3 walls and a series of metal brackets that had obviously been designed to support equipment whose purpose was no longer apparent. The floor was paved with brick laid in patterns that provided drainage toward a central point where a small opening suggested connection to systems that extended deeper underground. Most significantly, the hidden room ceiling featured the terminus of one of the mysterious chimney systems that Dr. Reeves had identified, with ventilation capabilities that would have been essential for activities requiring controlled air circulation. The engineering was sophisticated and professional, indicating that whoever had designed the space understood requirements for safety and efficiency that extended beyond amateur construction capabilities. Marcus's attempt to trace the drainage system in the hidden room's floor led to the discovery that the basement contained access points to underground passages that extended beyond the house's foundation. The passages were narrow but tall enough for adult humans to navigate, with stone walls and arched ceilings that demonstrated the same construction quality as the house's visible architecture. The engineering required to excavate and construct such passages represented a significant investment of time, money, and expertise that far exceeded anything required for typical domestic purposes. The passages themselves contained evidence of regular use that had continued long after their original construction. The stone floors showed wear patterns consistent with frequent foot traffic, while the walls bore marks from equipment that had been moved through the tunnels over extended periods. Several chambers along the main passage contained built-in storage systems with wooden shelving and metal hardware that had been maintained in excellent condition despite decades of apparent abandonment. Dr. Reeves's second visit to examine Marcus's Discoveries confirmed that the underground systems represented sophisticated engineering that was unusual for rural Pennsylvania properties. Her expertise in historical construction techniques allowed her to date the tunnel construction to the same period as the house's original building, indicating that the underground features were integral to Silas Hartwell's original design rather than later additions. The implication suggested planning and purpose that extended far beyond typical residential requirements. This level of underground construction was expensive and labor-intensive, Dr. Reeves observed while examining the tunnel system's engineering. The investment required would have been substantial, and the technical expertise necessary suggests professional involvement rather than amateur construction. The timing of construction corresponds to the pre-Prohibition period, which raises interesting questions about the original purpose and subsequent use of these facilities. Marcus's exploration of the tunnel system revealed that the passages extended far beyond the house's immediate vicinity, connecting to at least 3 other chambers that had been excavated at strategic points around the property. The engineering included sophisticated drainage systems that kept the tunnels dry despite their underground location, and ventilation systems that provided air circulation throughout the network. The scale and complexity of the construction suggested infrastructure that had been designed to support significant commercial operations rather than personal use. The discovery of bottling equipment stored in one of the remote chambers provided conclusive evidence about the tunnel system's historical purpose. The equipment was antique but well preserved, including glass bottles with distinctive shapes that Marcus recognized from Prohibition-era photographs, copper tubing that had been used for distillation processes, and wooden crates bearing shipping labels from companies that had operated during the 1920s. The equipment's condition suggested that it had been carefully maintained and protected rather than abandoned or forgotten. Sarah's reaction to Marcus's discoveries was complex, combining excitement about the historical significance with concern about the legal and financial implications of owning property that had been used for illegal activities. Her knowledge of local history was limited, but she understood enough about prohibition enforcement to recognize that the tunnel system represented evidence of federal crimes that might still carry legal consequences for current property owners. The discovery complicated their situation by adding historical significance that might support Marcus's preservation arguments while creating potential liabilities that Hammond's offer would eliminate. The timing of Marcus's discoveries created additional pressure as Hammond's purchase deadline approached, and financial circumstances made accepting the offer increasingly necessary. The tunnel system's existence suggested that the property's value might extend far beyond conventional real estate assessments, but determining that value would require professional evaluation that Marcus couldn't afford and expertise that wasn't readily available. The irony was devastating. He had discovered evidence that might justify his preservation efforts, precisely when circumstances made continuation impossible. What Marcus couldn't yet understand was the full scope of what lay beneath his property, or the true value of artifacts and architectural features that represented one of the most complete and well-preserved Prohibition-era distribution networks in Pennsylvania. The tunnels held secrets that would soon transform his understanding of the Hartwell legacy and provide the financial justification for choices that had previously seemed sentimental rather than practical. Hammond's reaction to news of the historical discoveries was swift and sophisticated, employing the same strategic thinking that had made him successful in commercial development, while targeting Marcus's growing support network with surgical precision. Within days of the first newspaper article about the Prohibition-era tunnels, Marcus began receiving phone calls from professionals who had previously expressed interest in supporting the preservation project, but were now withdrawing their involvement due to what they described as concerns about liability and professional reputation. Dr. Reeves was the first to experience pressure when the college administration received an anonymous complaint questioning her use of university resources for projects that hadn't been approved through proper academic channels. The complaint suggested that her involvement in evaluating the Hartwell property constituted inappropriate use of her position for personal benefit, and it requested investigation into whether her activities violated university policies regarding outside consulting work and potential conflicts of interest. The investigation was bureaucratic rather than substantive, but it created exactly the kind of professional disruption that would discourage continued involvement in controversial projects. Dr. Reeves found herself spending hours completing paperwork and attending meetings to explain activities that had previously been considered normal academic inquiry. Her department chair, while supportive, advised her to limit her involvement in the project until the investigation was completed, effectively removing her expertise precisely when Marcus needed it most. Someone with significant influence is making phone calls, Dr. Reeves explained during a brief conversation with Marcus before suspending her involvement in the project. Her tone carried the frustration of someone who understood exactly what was happening but couldn't prove deliberate interference. The timing and specificity of these complaints suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Whoever is behind this knows exactly how academic bureaucracy works and how to use it as a weapon. Janet Morrison's soil analysis work faced similar interference when her county supervisor received inquiries from developers interested in the same federal water management project that had brought her to the Hartwell property initially. The developers expressed concern about potential environmental complications that might arise if historical preservation activities interfered with future water resource development in the area. Their questions were presented as legitimate due diligence, but they created pressure for the county to limit Morrison's involvement in activities that might complicate future development opportunities. Morrison's supervisor instructed her to complete her original soil analysis quickly and avoid any activities that might be construed as advocacy for particular land use decisions. The directive effectively prevented her from conducting the detailed subsurface mapping that would have documented the full extent of the tunnel network, eliminating scientific evidence that could support historical designation applications. Morrison complied with her supervisor's instructions while privately expressing frustration about political interference in scientific research. The media attention that had initially seemed beneficial for Marcus's cause became a double-edged weapon when Hammond's public relations firm began providing alternative perspectives to journalists covering the story. The firm specialized in crisis management for development projects that faced historical preservation challenges, and their approach involved raising questions about the costs and practicality of preservation efforts rather than directly attacking the historical significance of discoveries. Local newspaper coverage began including expert commentary about the financial burden that historical designation would place on taxpayers through reduced property tax revenue and increased municipal costs for tourism infrastructure. The analysis was technically accurate, but presented in ways that emphasized costs while minimizing benefits, creating public perception that preservation efforts were expensive, indulgences that the community couldn't afford during periods of economic constraint. Regional television coverage shifted from human interest stories about historical discoveries to investigative reporting about the regulatory complications that historical designation could create for property owners throughout the area. The reports suggested that preserving the Hartwell property might establish precedents that would restrict development rights on other properties, threatening property values and economic development opportunities that the community needed for long-term prosperity. Hammond's influence within the regional banking community created additional pressure through systematic restriction of financing options that Marcus might have used to support preservation efforts while waiting for federal grant approvals. Banks that had previously expressed willingness to consider bridge financing for restoration projects suddenly revised their lending criteria in ways that eliminated Marcus's qualification for any loans. secured by property with uncertain development. Potential. The banking pressure extended beyond simple loan denials to include suggestions that Marcus's current financial obligations might require immediate attention if his income situation didn't improve quickly. Several institutions that held various accounts began requiring additional documentation and imposing restrictions that made routine financial activities more complicated and time-consuming. The effect was to create artificial urgency about his financial situation while eliminating options for addressing it through conventional means. Sarah's employment situation deteriorated when the school district's budget committee received detailed analysis of costs associated with employing teachers whose spouses were involved in controversial local issues that might reflect negatively on the district's reputation. The analysis was presented as objective risk assessment rather than targeted harassment, but it identified potential complications that could arise if preservation activities generated negative publicity that affected the district's relationships with taxpayers and funding sources. The school board's discussion of the issue was conducted in executive session, but the message reached Sarah through informal channels that her continued employment might depend on avoiding activities that could be construed as political advocacy. Her principal, while sympathetic, advised her to maintain professional distance from preservation activities until the situation resolved itself, effectively silencing one of Marcus's most important sources of emotional and financial support. Harold Brennan experienced pressure through the Agricultural Extension Service when his participation in soil conservation programs came under review, following complaints about his involvement in activities that might interfere with legitimate development opportunities in the area. The complaints suggested that his support for historical preservation reflected poor judgment about land use priorities that could affect his eligibility for federal agricultural support programs. The review process required Harold to complete extensive paperwork documenting his farming activities and justify his participation in conservation programs that provided financial incentives for sustainable land management. The bureaucratic burden was significant for someone managing a working farm, and the implicit threat was clear. Continued support for Marcus's preservation efforts could jeopardize agricultural subsidies that Harold's operation depended on for financial viability. Michael Torres faced pressure through professional organizations when colleagues began receiving inquiries about his qualifications for evaluating properties with complex legal and financial issues. The inquiries questioned whether his assessment methodology was appropriate for situations involving potential federal investigations and whether his involvement might create liability for institutions that relied on his recommendations for grant applications and preservation decisions. Torres's professional reputation was built on accuracy and conservative assessment practices, making him particularly vulnerable to suggestions that his work on the Hartwell property might have been influenced by advocacy rather than objective analysis. The pressure was subtle but effective, creating doubt about his credibility while suggesting that continued involvement in controversial projects might damage his reputation throughout the preservation community. James Patterson's restoration business faced economic pressure when several pending contracts were suddenly canceled due to what clients described as budget constraints and changing priorities. The cancellations occurred simultaneously across different types of projects, suggesting coordination rather than coincidental economic problems among unrelated customers. Patterson's cash flow became problematic precisely when Marcus needed his continued involvement in developing restoration plans and cost estimates. The pattern of cancellations targeted Patterson's work on other historical properties, creating financial pressure that made his pro bono involvement in the Hartwell project unsustainable. His business couldn't absorb the revenue loss while maintaining the quality of work that had built his reputation, forcing him to prioritize paying customers over preservation advocacy that had become economically dangerous. Rebecca Martinez encountered pressure through the State Bar Association when her representation of property owners in historical preservation matters came under scrutiny following complaints about potential conflicts of interest in cases involving federal funding and environmental regulations. The complaints suggested that her advocacy for preservation might compromise her objectivity in providing legal advice about complex regulatory matters. Martinez's legal practice specialized in exactly the kind of historical property issues that Marcus's situation involved. But the Bar Association inquiry created professional complications that required significant time and resources to address. Her malpractice insurance carrier advised her to limit her involvement in controversial cases until the inquiry was resolved, effectively removing legal expertise that Marcus desperately needed to navigate the regulatory challenges ahead. Cumulative effect of these coordinated pressures was systematic isolation that left Marcus without the professional support network that had made preservation seem possible. Each withdrawal was presented as independent decision-making based on legitimate concerns rather than coordinated campaign. But the timing and consistency suggested orchestration by someone with extensive knowledge of how professional communities operated and how to exploit their vulnerabilities. Sarah's response to the mounting pressure reflected the strain that Hammond's campaign was placing on their marriage and their individual sense of security. Her conversations with Marcus became increasingly focused on practical concerns about their financial survival and their ability to maintain their current lifestyle if the pressure continued to escalate. The romantic appeal of preserving family history was being overwhelmed by immediate concerns about paying bills and maintaining employment. "Maybe my parents are right," Sarah said during one particularly difficult evening when Marcus had received notice that his liability insurance was being canceled due to what the company described as increased risk associated with operating historical sites without proper safety protocols. Her voice carried exhaustion rather than conviction, but her words reflected growing doubt about whether their preservation efforts were worth the personal cost they were paying. Marcus's response was complicated by his growing understanding that Hammond's campaign was being conducted with resources and sophistication that exceeded anything he could counter through individual resistance. The systematic targeting of his support network demonstrated coordination and planning that suggested long-term strategy rather than spontaneous reaction to unwelcome developments. Someone was investing significant time and money in ensuring that preservation efforts failed, and Marcus couldn't understand why the Hartwell property was worth such an extensive campaign. The pressure campaign reached new intensity when Hammond arranged for a county commissioner to propose an emergency ordinance requiring immediate structural inspections of all properties that contained underground features that might pose public safety risks. The ordinance was presented as public safety measure following reports of unstable conditions in abandoned mine shafts throughout the region, but its timing and specific language targeted exactly the kind of historical underground features that Marcus had discovered. The proposed inspection requirements included provisions for immediate occupancy restrictions if underground features were deemed potentially hazardous, effectively providing legal authority to force evacuation of the property. While preservation applications were pending, the ordinance also included liability provisions that would make property owners financially responsible for any injuries or property damage that might result from underground instability, creating insurance requirements that most property owners couldn't meet. The public hearing on the proposed ordinance was scheduled for the following week, with final voting scheduled for 2 weeks later, creating a timeline that would force Marcus to make decisions about the property's future before preservation applications could be processed or funding could be secured. The timing was designed to eliminate alternatives and force acceptance of Hammond's offer as the only viable option for avoiding legal and financial catastrophe. What Marcus couldn't yet comprehend was that Hammond's desperate campaign to acquire the property was driven by knowledge that went far beyond simple commercial opportunity. and that the true value of what lay beneath the Hartwell homestead would soon be revealed in ways that would transform his understanding of what he was fighting to preserve. Marcus's breakthrough came through an unexpected source when Eleanor's personal papers revealed correspondence that she had carefully preserved but never discussed with family members. While organizing documents in preparation for what seemed like inevitable departure from the property, Marcus discovered a wooden box hidden behind loose boards in Eleanor's bedroom closet, containing letters, photographs, and legal documents that spanned nearly 60 years of the property's history. The correspondence included letters from federal agents who had maintained contact with Eleanor throughout her adult life, not as suspects in ongoing investigations, but as sources of information about historical preservation and legal protections for properties with significant cultural value. The letters revealed that Eleanor had been aware of the tunnel system's existence and historical importance, and that she had been quietly working with federal authorities to document and preserve evidence of Prohibition-era activities for eventual historical designation. Agent Robert Martinez of the FBI's Historical Crimes Unit had corresponded with Eleanor regularly since the 1960s, when federal authorities had begun systematic documentation of Prohibition-era enforcement activities as part of academic research projects. The letters revealed that Eleanor had been providing photographs, measurements, and historical information about the tunnel system to federal researchers who were compiling comprehensive records of bootlegging operations throughout Pennsylvania. Mrs. Hartwell's cooperation has been invaluable in documenting one of the most sophisticated illegal alcohol distribution networks that federal agents investigated during the Prohibition era. Agent Martinez had written in a 1987 letter that Marcus found particularly significant. The level of preservation at your property is exceptional, and the artifacts you've documented represent some of the most complete evidence we have of how these operations functioned on a day-to-day basis. The federal correspondence revealed that the Hartwell property was already known to historical preservation authorities as a site of exceptional significance, and that Eleanor had been working toward formal historical designation at the time of her death. Her efforts had been delayed by bureaucratic processes and funding limitations, but the foundation for preservation had been established through decades of careful documentation and relationship building with appropriate federal agencies. Marcus's contact with Agent Martinez's successor, Agent Lisa Thompson, confirmed that federal interest in the property had never diminished despite Eleanor's death. Agent Thompson explained that the FBI's Historical Crimes Unit maintained files on significant Prohibition-era sites throughout the country, and that the Hartwell property was considered one of the most important undeveloped historical resources in their database. Your grandmother's documentation is extraordinarily comprehensive, Agent Thompson explained during their phone conversation. She provided evidence that confirms this was the distribution hub for illegal alcohol throughout central Pennsylvania. During the peak enforcement years, the federal government has been waiting for an appropriate opportunity to support formal preservation of this site. Agent Thompson's information included details about the investigation that Marcus had never known existed. Federal authorities had determined that the Hartwell property had been the center of a distribution network that supplied illegal alcohol to markets throughout Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. The operation had been sophisticated enough to avoid prosecution during active enforcement, and it had generated revenue that would be worth millions of dollars in contemporary currency. The federal records also contained information about Hammond Pemberton II, Hammond's father, who had been investigated as a potential customer of the bootlegging operation during the 1920s. The investigation had never resulted in criminal charges, but federal agents had documented financial transactions between Pemberton family businesses and suspected bootlegging operations, suggesting that Hammond's current interest in the property might be motivated by family history rather than simple commercial opportunity. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, an economics professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who specialized in Prohibition-era financial networks, became involved when Agent Thompson referred Marcus to academic researchers who had been studying the economic impact of illegal alcohol operations. Dr. Warren's research had identified the Hartwell property as the probable center of one of the most profitable bootlegging enterprises in the Northeast, based on analysis of financial records and enforcement reports from the period. Dr. Warren's economic analysis revealed that the Hartwell operation had generated revenue that would exceed $10 million in contemporary purchasing power, making it one of the most successful illegal businesses of the Prohibition era. The scale of the operation explained the sophisticated infrastructure that Marcus had discovered, and it suggested that artifacts and architectural features at the site would have substantial value to museums and collectors interested in Prohibition-era history. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The financial record suggests that this operation was generating more revenue than most legitimate businesses of the period. Dr. Warren explained during her evaluation of Eleanor's preserved documentation. The investment in infrastructure and the scale of operations indicate that your great-great-grandfather was essentially running a multinational distribution company that happened to be dealing in illegal products. Dr. Warren's connections in the museum community revealed additional information about the potential value of Prohibition-era artifacts and architectural features. Several major museums had expressed interest in acquiring complete Prohibition-era installations for permanent exhibitions, and the market value for authentic bootlegging equipment had increased dramatically as collectors recognized the historical significance of well-preserved examples. The Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History had been searching for an intact Prohibition-era distribution facility that could be preserved as a permanent exhibition demonstrating the economic and social impact of prohibition enforcement. Dr. Warren's preliminary inquiries suggested that the museum would be interested in providing substantial funding for preservation of the Hartwell site in exchange for exclusive access for research and educational programming. Marcus's research into Hammond's family history revealed connections to the Prohibition-era investigations that explained his determination to acquire the property despite its apparent commercial limitations. Hammond Pemberton, too, had been a significant figure in Philadelphia's business community during the 1920s, and his commercial success had coincided with the period when the Hartwell bootlegging operation was most active. Federal investigation records that Agent Thompson provided access to through official channels revealed that Hammond Pemberton, too, had been suspected of providing financial backing for illegal alcohol operations in exchange for exclusive distribution rights in Philadelphia markets. The investigation had focused on his construction company's involvement in building underground storage facilities and transportation infrastructure that supported bootlegging operations throughout the region. The federal records suggested that the Pemberton family's wealth had been significantly enhanced by profits from Prohibition-era activities, though criminal charges had never been filed due to insufficient evidence and the complex network of legitimate businesses that had been used to conceal illegal operations. Hammond's current interest in the Hartwell property appeared to be motivated by desire to eliminate evidence that could damage his family's reputation if the historical significance of the site became widely known. Jennifer Walsh, an investigative journalist who specialized in political and business corruption, became interested in the story when Dr. Warren mentioned the connections between historical preservation efforts and contemporary development pressure. Walsh's experience with similar cases had taught her to recognize patterns of intimidation and pressure that were designed to force property owners into accepting unfavorable deals while concealing the true motivations behind acquisition efforts. Investigation into Hammond's recent business activities revealed a pattern of property acquisitions that targeted sites with potential historical significance, particularly properties that might contain evidence of Prohibition-era activities that could embarrass prominent families or complicate development projects. Her research suggested that Hammond had been systematically acquiring and demolishing properties throughout the region that might contain similar historical evidence. "The pattern is clear once you know what to look for," Walsh explained during her interview with Marcus about the pressure campaign he had been experiencing. Pemberton has been targeting properties that might contain evidence of his family's Prohibition-era activities, acquiring them through pressure campaigns that force owners to sell below market value rather than risk financial ruin through systematic harassment. Walsh's investigation revealed that the pressure campaign against Marcus followed exactly the same pattern that Hammond had used successfully against at least 6 other property owners during the previous decade. The systematic targeting of professional networks, the coordination of regulatory pressure, and the strategic use of financial leverage were sophisticated techniques that required substantial resources and extensive connections throughout the business and political communities. The documentation that Walsh assembled included evidence of similar pressure campaigns that had forced other property owners to abandon historical preservation efforts in favor of accepting Hammond's acquisition offers. The pattern suggested systematic elimination of historical sites that might contain evidence damaging to the Pemberton family's reputation, representing a deliberate effort to control the historical narrative about Prohibition-era activities. In the region, Marcus's contact with previous victims of Hammond's pressure campaigns revealed additional information about the techniques that had been used against other property owners and the resources that Hammond was willing to deploy to achieve his objectives. 3 families had lost properties that contained Prohibition-era features after facing financial and legal pressure that had made continued ownership impossible despite their desire to preserve family heritage. The previous victims' experiences provided Marcus with detailed information about the progression of pressure tactics that he could expect if he continued to resist Hammond's acquisition efforts. The campaigns typically escalated through professional isolation, financial pressure, regulatory harassment, and legal threats before culminating in emergency situations that forced immediate decision-making under artificial deadlines. Sarah's investigation into her father's business practices revealed information that she had never known about his acquisition strategies and his willingness to use family connections to achieve commercial objectives. Her access to family financial records and business documents provided evidence of expenditures that corresponded to the pressure campaigns that previous property owners had described, confirming that Hammond was investing substantial resources in acquiring specific properties rather than simply pursuing convenient development opportunities. "I found payments to consulting firms that specialize in crisis management and opposition research," Sarah explained to Marcus after discovering documentation that her father had tried to conceal. "The amounts involved are significant, and the timing corresponds exactly to the periods when other property owners were experiencing the kind of pressure we've been facing." Sarah's discoveries included evidence that Hammond had been planning his acquisition of the Hartwell property for several years, beginning long before Marcus had inherited it from Eleanor. The planning had included detailed research into the property's historical significance and systematic identification of pressure points that could be used to force a sale. If direct negotiation proved unsuccessful, the revelation that Hammond's interest in the property was based on detailed knowledge of its historical significance rather than simple commercial opportunity transformed Marcus's understanding of his situation. Rather than representing a generous offer to help family members, Hammond's acquisition attempt was a calculated effort to eliminate evidence that could damage his family's reputation while acquiring a historically significant property for a fraction of its true value. Agent Thompson's offer to provide federal support for historical preservation efforts included access to resources that could counter Hammond's pressure campaign while protecting Marcus's rights as a property owner. Federal interest in preserving the site created legal protections that would prevent local authorities from forcing emergency inspections or occupancy restrictions that might interfere with legitimate preservation activities. The federal support also included access to legal resources that could investigate whether Hammond's pressure campaign violated federal laws regarding interference with historical preservation efforts or conspiracy to deprive property owners of their civil rights. The FBI's interest in the case was based on the historical significance of the site, but their investigation would necessarily include examination of contemporary activities that might constitute criminal interference with legitimate preservation efforts. Marcus's growing network of federal, academic, and media allies represented resources that Hammond had not anticipated when planning his acquisition strategy. The combination of historical significance, federal interest, and media attention created protections that made continued pressure campaigns increasingly risky for Hammond while providing Marcus with alternatives to accepting an acquisition offer that was designed to eliminate, rather than preserve, the property's true value. The investigation had revealed that Marcus was not simply defending a family property against commercial development, but protecting a nationally significant historical site against systematic efforts to conceal evidence of Prohibition-era activities that could embarrass prominent families and complicate their contemporary business interests. The emergency county commissioner meeting drew an unusually large crowd for a Tuesday evening in December, with more than 200 residents filling the municipal building's main chamber and spilling into adjacent rooms where speakers had been hastily installed to accommodate the overflow attendance. The proposed emergency ordinance regarding underground structural safety had generated intense community interest, particularly among property owners who were concerned about the financial implications of mandatory inspections and potential occupancy restrictions. Hammond had orchestrated the meeting with theatrical precision, ensuring that media representatives were present to document what he expected would be Marcus's public humiliation and final capitulation. 3 television news crews occupied strategic positions throughout the chamber, while reporters from regional newspapers prepared to cover what Hammond's public relations firm had characterized as a critical public safety issue that required immediate community action. Marcus arrived with Sarah and Harold Brennan, their small group dwarfed by the crowd of supporters that Hammond had mobilized through his extensive network of business associates, political connections, and community organizations. The audience was carefully composed to include property developers, construction contractors, real estate professionals, and local business owners who had been briefed about the economic benefits that responsible development could bring to the community. County Commissioner Bradley Morrison, who had introduced the emergency ordinance at Hammond's suggestion, opened the proceedings with a presentation about underground safety hazards that emphasized dramatic examples of structural collapses and environmental contamination that had occurred at other sites throughout Pennsylvania. His presentation included graphic photographs and detailed cost estimates for cleanup operations, creating an atmosphere of crisis that suggested immediate action was necessary to protect public safety. "We cannot allow romantic attachment to the past to compromise public safety and community welfare," Commissioner Morrison declared while displaying photographs of sinkholes and structural damage that had supposedly resulted from unstable underground conditions. Property owners who choose to maintain hazardous conditions must be held accountable for the risks they create for their neighbors and the community at large. Hammond's presentation was masterfully crafted to present Marcus as an irresponsible property owner whose selfish attachment to a deteriorating structure was creating risks that threatened community safety and economic development. His slides included professional engineering reports that had been commissioned specifically for this meeting, documenting alleged structural deficiencies and environmental hazards that required immediate professional attention regardless of historical significance or preservation intentions. Ladies and gentlemen, we have documented evidence of unstable underground conditions that pose immediate risks to public safety, Hammond announced while pointing to diagrams that depicted theoretical collapse scenarios and groundwater contamination possibilities. Mr. Chen-Hartwell's refusal to address these hazards in favor of pursuing romantic, historical fantasies puts our entire community at risk of environmental disaster and potential legal liability. Hammond's attack escalated to personal accusations about Marcus's competence and financial responsibility. He presented documentation suggesting that Marcus lacked the professional qualifications necessary to evaluate structural safety, the financial resources required to address identified hazards, and the practical experience needed to manage historical preservation projects of such complexity and scope. This is not a matter of historical preservation versus commercial development, Hammond continued, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. This is a matter of community safety versus individual negligence. Mr. Chen-Hartwell's amateur attempts at property maintenance have created conditions that threaten not only his own safety, but the safety of his neighbors and the environmental integrity of our community's water resources. The accusations were carefully crafted to attack Marcus's credibility while avoiding specific claims that could be proven false. Hammond suggested rather than stated, implied rather than declared, and created impressions rather than making assertions that could be challenged through factual rebuttal. The technique was sophisticated and effective, creating doubt about Marcus's competence while maintaining plausible deniability about the accuracy of the underlying allegations. Marcus's opportunity to respond came after 2 hours of presentations that had systematically attacked his qualifications, his financial resources, his preservation plans, and his commitment to community welfare. He approached the podium knowing that his response would determine not only the fate of his property, but his reputation within the community and his relationship with Sarah, whose growing discomfort with the public scrutiny had become increasingly obvious throughout the evening. Commissioner Morrison, Mr. Pemberton, fellow citizens, Marcus began, his voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere that Hammond had created through careful stage management. The allegations that have been presented tonight are based on incomplete information and assumptions that ignore the true nature of what we're dealing with at the Hartwell property. Marcus's response was interrupted by Hammond's demand for specific evidence to support his claims about the property's historical significance and structural safety. The interruption was designed to force Marcus into defensive explanations that would appear inadequate compared to Hammond's professional presentations, but it created an opening that Marcus had been hoping Hammond would provide. Mr. Pemberton asks for evidence, Marcus said, his tone becoming more confident as he realized that Hammond's aggressive tactics were about to backfire spectacularly. I'm prepared to provide exactly that, though I suspect Mr. Pemberton already knows more about the Hartwell property's true significance than he has shared with this community. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted as Marcus began presenting documentation that he had been holding in reserve for exactly this moment. His evidence included federal correspondence that confirmed the property's national historical significance, museum interest in preservation and exhibition, and most significantly, FBI files that documented the Prohibition-era investigations that had connected the Hartwell operation to prominent Philadelphia families, including the Pembertons. The underground features that Mr. Pemberton characterizes as safety hazards are actually components of one of the most sophisticated and well-preserved Prohibition-era distribution networks that federal authorities have documented, Marcus announced, while displaying photographs and federal documents that Agent Thompson had provided for this purpose. The FBI's Historical Crimes Unit has been working with my family for decades to preserve evidence of operations that generated revenue equivalent to tens of millions of contemporary dollars. The revelation created immediate chaos in the chamber as audience members realized that the emergency Ordinance was not about public safety, but about concealing historical evidence that could embarrass prominent families. Hammond's carefully orchestrated presentation was collapsing as Marcus systematically dismantled the rationale for emergency action, while revealing the true motivations behind the acquisition pressure he had been experiencing. Marcus's presentation escalated to include evidence of Hammond's systematic pressure campaign against other property owners who had possessed Prohibition-era artifacts or historical sites. The documentation included financial records showing payments to consulting firms that specialized in opposition research and crisis management, confirming that Hammond had been investing substantial resources in eliminating historical sites throughout the region. Mr. Pemberton's interest in acquiring the Hartwell property is not motivated by concern for community safety or development opportunities, Marcus declared while displaying copies of federal investigation files that documented the Pemberton family's suspected involvement in Prohibition-era illegal activities. His motivation is eliminating evidence that could damage his family's reputation and complicate his business interests. Hammond's response was immediate and desperate, involving accusations that Marcus was conducting a politically motivated attack designed to distract attention from legitimate safety concerns. His counterattack included suggestions that Marcus's preservation efforts were being funded by federal authorities who were pursuing political agendas rather than genuine historical preservation, and that the entire historical designation process was fraudulent manipulation designed to avoid accountability for property maintenance obligations. This is exactly the kind of conspiracy theory nonsense that irresponsible property owners use to justify endangering their communities, Hammond declared, his composed demeanor finally cracking under pressure as his acquisition strategy collapsed. In public view, Mr. Chen-Hartwell is trying to turn legitimate safety concerns into political theater because he cannot address the fundamental reality that his property represents a public hazard that requires immediate professional attention. The confrontation escalated when Marcus presented evidence that Hammond had been monitoring his activities and coordinating pressure campaigns through surveillance and investigation techniques that potentially violated federal laws regarding interference with historical preservation efforts. The evidence included documentation of the systematic targeting of his professional network, the coordination of regulatory pressure, and the strategic use of family connections to create artificial financial emergencies. Jennifer Walsh's presence in the audience as an investigative journalist provided additional credibility for Marcus's allegations, as she confirmed that her research had documented similar pressure campaigns against other property owners throughout the region. Her investigation had revealed a pattern of acquisition activities that targeted properties with Prohibition-era significance, representing systematic efforts to control historical narrative rather than pursue legitimate commercial development. I've documented at least 6 other cases where Mr. Pemberton has used identical tactics to force property owners to abandon historical preservation efforts, Walsh announced when Commissioner Morrison allowed her to address the chamber. The pattern includes professional isolation, financial pressure, regulatory harassment, and manufactured emergencies that create artificial deadlines for decision-making under duress. The audience's reaction to Walsh's confirmation of Marcus's allegations was immediate and dramatic, with murmurs of outrage spreading throughout the chamber as community members realized they had been manipulated into supporting an acquisition strategy based on fraudulent safety concerns. Hammond's supporters began distancing themselves from his presentation as the true nature of his agenda became apparent. Dr. Warren's arrival with additional documentation about the property's economic significance provided final confirmation that Marcus's preservation efforts were based on legitimate historical value rather than romantic attachment to family property. Her economic analysis revealed that the Prohibition-era artifacts and architectural features represented cultural resources worth millions of dollars in museum and collector markets. The Hartwell property contains one of the most complete and well-preserved examples of Prohibition-era commercial infrastructure that has been documented anywhere in the United States. Dr. Warren explained while presenting museum correspondence, confirming institutional interest in preservation and exhibition. The Smithsonian Institution has already expressed formal interest in providing funding for preservation, in exchange for research access and educational programming opportunities. Agent Thompson's telephone participation in the meeting provided federal confirmation that the FBI's Historical Crimes Unit considered the Hartwell property a nationally significant historical site that was eligible for federal protection and funding. Her statement confirmed that federal authorities had been investigating Hammond's pressure campaign as potential interference with legitimate historical preservation activities. The federal government has substantial interest in preserving this site for research and educational purposes, Agent Thompson announced through the Chamber's speaker system. Any activities that interfere with legitimate preservation efforts or threaten the integrity of historical evidence could constitute federal violations that would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Commissioner Morrison's attempt to maintain control over the proceedings became increasingly futile as the evidence against Hammond's emergency ordinance accumulated and public opinion shifted dramatically in Marcus's favor. The commissioner's own involvement in proposing the ordinance, based on Hammond's fraudulent safety concerns, created potential legal liability that required immediate consultation with county attorneys. The meeting's conclusion involved withdrawal of the emergency ordinance pending further investigation into the allegations that had been presented, effectively eliminating the artificial deadline that Hammond had created to force Marcus's capitulation. The public revelation of Hammond's true motivations and methods had transformed him from respected community leader into subject of federal investigation and media scrutiny. Sarah's reaction to the evening's revelations was complex, combining relief about the resolution of immediate pressure with shock about her father's activities and the extent of his deception regarding his motivations for acquiring the property. Her discovery that Hammond had been willing to destroy Marcus's reputation and financial security to conceal family history represented a fundamental betrayal of the values she had been raised to respect. The confrontation had exposed Hammond's systematic campaign as fraudulent manipulation designed to eliminate historical evidence rather than address legitimate community concerns, transforming Marcus from irresponsible property owner into victim of sophisticated conspiracy that violated federal laws and community standards of ethical behavior. What remained to be revealed was the full scope of the historical treasure that had motivated Hammond's desperate campaign and the true value of artifacts that would soon establish the Hartwell property as one of the most significant Prohibition-era historical sites in the nation. The comprehensive archaeological survey began 3 days after the county commission meeting, when a team of federal historians, museum specialists, and preservation experts arrived to conduct the most thorough documentation of a Prohibition-era site that had ever been attempted in the United States. The team was led by Dr. Catherine Blake from the Smithsonian Institution, whose expertise in Prohibition-era material culture had made her the leading authority on bootlegging operations and their historical significance. Dr. Blake's initial assessment of the tunnel system exceeded every expectation that federal authorities had developed based on Eleanor's correspondence and Marcus's preliminary documentation. The underground network was not simply a distribution facility, but a complete industrial complex that had supported every aspect of illegal alcohol production and distribution. From manufacturing through final delivery to urban markets throughout the Northeast Corridor, the main production facility, located in the largest underground chamber beneath the Hartwell House, contained distillation equipment that represented the most advanced technology available during the 1920s. The copper stills were custom manufactured pieces that would have cost thousands of dollars in period currency, while the fermentation tanks were precisely engineered to produce consistent quality spirits that commanded premium prices in sophisticated urban markets. This is not amateur bootlegging equipment, Dr. Blake explained while examining the distillation apparatus with museum quality lighting that revealed details that had been invisible during Marcus's initial explorations. This represents professional grade manufacturing capability that could produce hundreds of gallons of high-quality spirits per week. The investment in equipment alone would be worth over $1 million in contemporary currency. The storage facilities revealed the true scale of the operation through systematic documentation of bottle inventory, wooden crates, and shipping. Materials that had been preserved in climate-controlled conditions for nearly a century. The underground environment had prevented deterioration that would have destroyed similar artifacts stored above ground, creating a time capsule that provided unprecedented insight into Prohibition-era commercial practices. Dr. Maria Santos, SPEC, IALIST in Prohibition-era economics from Yale University, conducted detailed analysis of the business records that had been preserved in waterproof containers throughout the tunnel system. The documentation included customer lists, pricing schedules, delivery routes, and financial accounts that revealed the operation's sophisticated business practices and remarkable profitability. The financial records indicate monthly revenue that would exceed $200,000 in contemporary purchasing power. Dr. Santos announced while reviewing ledgers that detailed transactions with customers throughout Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. This was not a local bootlegging operation, but a regional distribution company that supplied illegal alcohol to markets in at least 6 major cities. The customer documentation was particularly significant because it included detailed records of transactions with prominent families and businesses throughout the region, confirming federal suspicions about the extent of illegal alcohol consumption among supposedly respectable citizens during the Prohibition era. The records provided evidence of systematic violation of federal law by community leaders, business owners, and political figures who had publicly supported Prohibition enforcement. Hammond, Pemberton II's name appeared throughout the business records as one of the operation's largest and most consistent customers, with transactions that totaled thousands of dollars in 1920s currency. The documentation confirmed that the Pemberton family's construction business had provided services to the bootlegging operation, including excavation work for tunnel expansion and installation of specialized equipment for alcohol production and storage. The records also revealed that Hammond Pemberton II had provided financial backing for the operation's expansion during the mid-1920s, when federal enforcement had increased pressure on smaller bootlegging enterprises throughout the region. His investment had funded equipment upgrades and security improvements that had allowed the Hartwell operation to continue functioning while competitors were eliminated through arrests and prosecutions. Dr. James Mitchell, a specialist in industrial archaeology from the University of Pennsylvania, led the technical analysis of the tunnel system's engineering and construction. His examination revealed sophisticated ventilation systems, electrical installations, and transportation infrastructure that demonstrated professional engineering expertise and substantial financial investment in creating permanent facilities rather than temporary operations. The engineering sophistication is remarkable for any construction project of this period, Dr. Mitchell explained while documenting the tunnel system's structural elements and mechanical systems. The ventilation design ensures optimal air quality for both worker safety and product quality, while the electrical systems provided lighting and power that would have been superior to most legitimate businesses of the era. The transportation infrastructure included rail systems for moving heavy equipment and product throughout the tunnel network, with narrow-gauge tracks that connected production facilities to storage areas and shipping points. The rail system was professionally installed with proper ballasting and drainage, indicating that the operation had been designed for long-term use rather than temporary convenience. Most significantly, Dr. Mitchell's survey revealed that the tunnel system extended far beyond what Marcus had initially discovered, connecting to at least 12 different access points throughout the surrounding area. The network included emergency exits, ventilation shafts, and communication systems that provided security and operational flexibility that had allowed the operation to avoid detection during federal investigations. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a museum specialist in Prohibition-era artifacts, conducted detailed inventory and valuation of the equipment, bottles, and promotional materials that had been preserved throughout the facility. Her assessment revealed artifacts that represented some of the most complete and well-preserved examples of bootlegging equipment and marketing materials that had ever been documented. The bottle collection alone represented significant historical value, including custom manufactured containers with distinctive designs that had been used to establish brand recognition in illegal alcohol markets. The bottles bore labels and sealing systems that demonstrated sophisticated marketing practices, contradicting popular assumptions about Prohibition-era alcohol being crudely produced and anonymously distributed. These bottles and labels represent sophisticated branding and quality control that would be impressive in legitimate businesses of any era. Dr. Rodriguez explained while photographing bottles that bore the Hartwell Reserve label and distinctive design elements that had established brand recognition throughout regional markets. The marketing sophistication indicates that this operation was competing on quality rather than simply price, suggesting customers who valued excellence over convenience. The promotional materials included advertising pieces, customer correspondence, and testimonials that revealed how the operation had maintained customer relationships and built brand loyalty despite the illegal nature of their business. The materials demonstrated marketing sophistication that rivaled legitimate businesses while providing insight into Prohibition-era consumer behavior and black market economics. Agent Thompson's participation in the survey provided federal confirmation that the evidence documented at the Hartwell property represented some of the most significant Prohibition-era discoveries that law enforcement authorities had encountered. The completeness of the operation and the quality of preservation created opportunities for historical research that had been impossible with previously discovered sites. Federal investigators during the Prohibition era suspected that operations of this sophistication existed, but they were never able to locate and document facilities that remained intact. Agent Thompson explained while reviewing artifacts that federal agents had searched for unsuccessfully during the 1920s. This site provides evidence that confirms historical theories about illegal alcohol production and distribution that could never be proven through enforcement records alone. The federal documentation also confirmed that similar operations had existed throughout the region, but that the Hartwell facility was unique in its completeness and state of preservation. Other sites had been discovered and dismantled during Prohibition enforcement, abandoned by operators who fled federal investigations, or destroyed by subsequent property owners who wanted to eliminate evidence of illegal activities. Dr. Blake's preliminary assessment for the Smithsonian Institution valued the complete facility and its contents at over $3 million in historical and educational significance, making it one of the most valuable Prohibition-era discoveries that the museum had evaluated. The valuation was based on the completeness of the facility, the quality of preservation, and the educational potential for understanding Prohibition-era economics and social history. The educational value alone justifies major investment in preservation and interpretation, Dr. Blake announced while completing her preliminary assessment for the Smithsonian's Acquisition Committee. This facility provides opportunities for research and public education that would enhance understanding of Prohibition-era history in ways that no other existing site can support. The Smithsonian's interest included immediate funding for preservation activities and long-term commitment to maintaining the site as a research facility and public education destination. The museum's proposal included restoration of the tunnel, system to museum standards, installation of interpretive exhibits, and development of educational programming that would serve students and researchers from throughout the country. Additional museum interest came from the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, which expressed desire to partner with the Smithsonian in developing exhibitions that would use the Hartwell facility to illustrate the social and economic consequences of prohibition enforcement. Their interest included funding for transportation systems that would allow public access to the underground facilities while maintaining historical integrity. The Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission confirmed that the property qualified for immediate inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places, with potential for designation as a National Historic Landmark based on its significance to understanding Prohibition-era history. The designations would provide legal protection against demolition while creating access to federal funding for preservation and interpretation activities. Local media coverage of the survey results created regional and national attention that transformed Marcus from unknown property owner into guardian of nationally significant historical resources. Television networks requested interviews about the discovery, while historical publications sought articles about the preservation efforts and their implications for understanding Prohibition-era economics. Sarah's reaction to the scope of the discoveries was amazement combined with vindication of Marcus's preservation instincts. Her earlier doubts about the wisdom of resisting her father's acquisition efforts were replaced by pride in their decision to pursue historical preservation despite financial pressure and family opposition. I never imagined that Dad's interest in the property was based on something this significant, Sarah reflected while touring the tunnel system with Dr. Blake's team. Marcus's instincts about preserving family history were right, but none of us understood how important that history really was. Hammond's response to the survey results was swift departure from the community, accompanied by legal representation that advised against any public statements about the historical discoveries or their implications for his family's reputation. His development company announced indefinite postponement of projects in the area, effectively ending his involvement in local affairs, while federal authorities continued investigating his pressure campaign against historical preservation efforts. Revelation that Hammond had been attempting to acquire and destroy evidence of his family's Prohibition-era activities created scandal that extended far beyond the local community. Regional newspapers investigated other properties that Hammond had acquired under suspicious circumstances, while federal authorities examined whether his activities constituted systematic obstruction of historical preservation efforts. Marcus's vindication was complete as the survey results confirmed that his preservation instincts had protected resources of national significance from destruction by someone whose family had profited from the same illegal activities that the tunnels represented. The irony was remarkable. Hammond had attempted to eliminate evidence of his family's Prohibition-era involvement by pressuring the descendant of the that operation they had supported financially. The financial transformation of Marcus's situation was immediate and dramatic as museum funding, federal grants, and tourism revenue projections eliminated every concern about property maintenance and restoration costs. The historical significance that Hammond had tried to suppress became the foundation for financial security that exceeded anything his acquisition offer could have provided. What had begun as a struggle to preserve family heritage despite financial limitations had become protection of national historical resources against systematic efforts to eliminate evidence of Prohibition-era activities that connected prominent families to illegal enterprises that had shaped regional economic development during the early 20th century. 3 years after the Prohibition Tunnel discovery, the Hartwell Historical Site welcomed its 10,000th visitor during the peak autumn tourism season that had transformed the rural Pennsylvania property into one of the region's most significant cultural destinations. Marcus stood on the restored Victorian porch, watching as tour groups moved between the meticulously preserved house and the underground. museum that had been constructed within the original tunnel system, marveling at how completely his life had changed since that desperate December when Hammond's pressure campaign had nearly forced him to abandon everything. The transformation had been systematic and comprehensive, funded through a combination of federal preservation grants, Smithsonian institution partnership agreements, and tourism revenue that consistently exceeded projections. The house itself had been restored to museum quality standards while maintaining its function as Marcus and Sarah's residence, creating a unique living history environment where visitors could experience authentic Prohibition-era domestic life. Alongside the commercial operation that had supported it. Dr. Blake's leadership of the restoration project had established new standards for Prohibition-era historical preservation, with the Hartwell site serving as a model for similar projects throughout the country. The underground facilities had been carefully restored to operational condition, allowing visitors to observe authentic distillation processes while learning about the economic and social forces that had created illegal alcohol markets during the enforcement period. The educational impact extended far beyond tourism, with the site serving as a research destination for universities throughout the Northeast. Graduate students conducted thesis research using the facility's archives, while undergraduate classes experienced hands-on learning about Prohibition-era economics, engineering, and social history. The revenue from educational programming had created a sustainable funding model that ensured long-term preservation without continued dependence on federal grants. Marcus's role had evolved from property owner to site director, with responsibilities that included overseeing daily operations, coordinating research activities, and managing the educational programs that serve thousands of students annually. His background in sustainable agriculture had proven surprisingly relevant to managing a historical site that required balancing preservation goals with public access while maintaining environmental sustainability. Sarah's career had been transformed by her involvement in developing educational curricula that used the site's resources to teach elementary and middle school students about local history and economic systems. Her programs had been adopted by school districts throughout Pennsylvania, while her expertise in historical education had led to consulting opportunities with other museums and historical sites. The couple's financial situation had been revolutionized through their management of the historical site, with their combined income from operations, educational programming, and consulting work exceeding anything that traditional careers could have provided. The property that Hammond had characterized as a financial liability had become the foundation for prosperity that supported their family while serving public educational goals. Hammond's exile from the community had been swift and complete following federal investigation that confirmed his systematic efforts to eliminate historical evidence throughout the region. His development company had collapsed under legal pressure and negative publicity, while his family's social standing had been destroyed by revelations about their Prohibition-era activities and contemporary cover-up efforts. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence that Hammond had destroyed Prohibition-era artifacts and architectural features at 6 other properties, eliminating historical evidence worth millions of dollars while violating federal laws regarding destruction of cultural resources. His conviction on federal charges had resulted in substantial fines and community service requirements that included funding for historical preservation projects throughout Pennsylvania. Victoria's reaction to the scandal had been withdrawal from social activities and eventual relocation to their Florida residence, where her reduced circumstances and damaged reputation had eliminated the social connections that had defined her identity. Her relationship with Sarah had been permanently altered by her support for Hammond's pressure campaign, creating distance that had never been fully repaired despite Sarah's attempts at reconciliation. The regional impact of the Hartwell site's success had created economic benefits that extended throughout the surrounding community. Local businesses had experienced increased revenue from tourism, While property values had risen due to the area's enhanced reputation as a cultural destination, the success had created a model for heritage tourism development that other communities were attempting to replicate. Harold Brennan's property had been incorporated into the historical site following discovery that his land contained additional tunnel access points and storage facilities that were integral to the original operation. His agreement to participate in the preservation project had provided him with tourism revenue that exceeded his farming income while allowing him to maintain agricultural operations that enhanced the site's authenticity. The Kowalski property, abandoned since the 1960s, had been acquired by the Historical Preservation Foundation and restored as a visitor center that provided orientation services and gift shop operations. The restoration had revealed additional artifacts and architectural features that enhanced understanding of how multiple families had participated in the bootlegging operation. Dr. Warren's economic analysis of the site's impact had documented regional economic benefits that exceeded $5 million annually, making the Hartwell Historical Site one of the most successful heritage tourism destinations in Pennsylvania. Her research had been used to support similar preservation projects throughout the country, demonstrating how historical sites could generate sustainable economic development in rural communities. Jennifer Walsh's investigative reporting about Hammond's systematic destruction of historical sites had earned national recognition and led to federal legislation strengthening protections for cultural resources on private property. Her work had exposed similar cover-up efforts in other states, creating national awareness about the vulnerability of historical sites to destruction by property owners seeking to conceal embarrassing family histories. The legal protections that had been established following the Hartwell case had prevented similar destruction of cultural resources while creating incentives for property owners to preserve and interpret historical sites rather than eliminate them. The legislation had been named the Hartwell Protection Act, ensuring that Marcus's struggle to preserve family heritage would have lasting impact on cultural resource protection throughout the country. Agent Thompson's continued involvement with the site had led to development of law enforcement training programs that used the facility to teach federal agents about identifying and protecting cultural resources during criminal investigations. The programs had enhanced federal capacity to recognize and preserve historical evidence while conducting contemporary investigations. The museum partnerships had expanded beyond the Smithsonian to include institutions throughout the Northeast, creating a network of Prohibition-era historical sites that provided comprehensive understanding of illegal alcohol production and distribution during the enforcement period. The Hartwell site served as the flagship facility that coordinated research and educational activities throughout the network. Marcus's daily routine now included morning tours of the tunnel system, afternoon meetings with researchers and educational groups, and evening administrative work that managed operations serving visitors from throughout the world. His office, located in Eleanor's former sewing room, contained correspondence from researchers, educators, and tourism officials who sought to learn from the site's success, the legacy that Eleanor had preserved through her careful documentation and federal cooperation had achieved significance beyond anything she could have imagined when she began corresponding with federal historians. Her vision of preserving family history for future generations had resulted in protection of national historical resources that would serve educational purposes for centuries. Sarah and Marcus's relationship had been strengthened by their shared commitment to preserving and interpreting the historical site, with their partnership extending beyond marriage to include professional collaboration that served goals larger than personal interests. Their success had demonstrated how family heritage could be preserved while serving public benefit and generating sustainable income. The evening sunset painted the restored Victorian house in golden light as the last tour group of the day emerged from the underground museum, their faces showing the amazement that Marcus had learned to recognize in visitors who experienced authentic historical sites for the first time. The transformation from struggling property owner to successful historical site director had exceeded every dream he had entertained during those desperate months when Hammond's pressure campaign had nearly destroyed everything. The Hartwell historical site had become proof that preserving family heritage could serve purposes beyond sentiment, creating educational and economic benefits that transformed communities while honoring the courage of previous generations who had taken extraordinary risks to survive difficult times. Marcus's decision to resist pressure and preserve family legacy had protected resources of national significance while creating prosperity that would support future generations. What started as one man's desperate fight to save his family's crumbling homestead had become a story of discovering hidden treasure that transformed not just his life, but an entire community's understanding of their history and potential. Have you ever wondered what secrets might be hidden in your own family's property? What stories are waiting to be discovered in old houses, forgotten documents, or local legends that everyone dismisses as folklore? Marcus's incredible journey from ridicule to recognition shows that sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in the places everyone else has given up on. If this story inspired you to look at your own family history with new eyes, or if you enjoyed discovering how one man's determination to preserve the past created an amazing future, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share your own family mystery stories in the comments below. You never know what incredible discoveries might be waiting in your own backyard. What hidden treasure will we uncover together next?